right, guys, welcome back. I hope you guys had an amazing weekend. Welcome to Metagame Monday. What a way to start the week. Welcome to my new audience. And of course, if you've been here before, you know what this is all about. This is about dissecting the results of the past week in order to put ourselves in a position to do well in the coming week. So this will be very useful. Some people find this kind of boring to do manually, so that was my motivation back in the day for creating this series. Is basically I want to make it fun to study the game and inspire people that way. So let's see if I succeed. Who knows? Let's jump into it. So 40 decks made up the 5 top 8s that I'm going to cover here. 5 Legacy challenges played on Magic Online, the most competitive place to play Magic, to play Legacy rather. And this first column has 6 copies of Delver, 6 copies of blue-black tempo. So again, these are the Daze decks of the format. Fair Daze decks, Policeman decks, blue decks. I'm a big boy. I cast Ponder. I'm just waiting for the call to be an honorary member of Mensa. These players will play these blue decks, and then you kind of pick depending on what you want to, beat on any given week. So this week, we see a huge uptick of the more mid-rangey Dimir tempo list without Delver. A big advantage of these decks is that you play longer, a bit better. You have some more durability when it comes to your threats. Maybe you're playing a little bit of Nethergoyf. Maybe you're playing like Baleful Strix alongside Kaito. You have the Tamios, where the Delver decks are more looking to close out the game. So within the Delver decks, we have some different versions, and actually Grixis is on an uptick, but I will cover that later. But that's interesting to know that out of these, we have a mono blue version, we have some Grixis, and we have some Teamer. I believe one of the tempo decks also splashed white, so that's, we've talked about this before. You get better removal spell out of Swords to Plowshares, maybe a little bit of Teferi or Prismatic Ending, but you get a worse mana base, you get Wastelanding more often, all of that jazz. We've talked about that before. Sometimes it makes sense, sometimes it doesn't, right? Next column, we have 3 very established decks with 4 top 8 appearances. So quick maths, they make up 10% of the top 8, all of the top 8 combined. We have Mono Red Prison. I'm responsible for one of these. I felt like Mono Red Prison was in a good position this weekend. I was hoping to crush a lot of Eldrazi, but that wasn't really the case. If you care about Mono Red Prison replays, analysis, deck tech, stuff like that, check out the video tomorrow. Mono Red is continuing to be a force in the metagame, and it will for the foreseeable future unless Eldrazi totally fizzles out. That's kind of what I'm watching when it comes to that deck. Then we have 4 copies of Oops. Oops is... That deck is so annoying, and it's just a constant threat. It puts a lot of pressure on your opening hands, and that's just a deck that will make me play one more Graveyard Hate than I'm quote-unquote supposed to in order to simply not lose to that deck. So don't lose to Oops. Don't leave your home without fast Graveyard Hate. Then we have 4 copies of Dimir Reanimator. That's kind of ticking down, I feel like. I feel like we've been at 6 and 5 copies the other weeks, so, it's close. But that deck is still hurting from having Psychic Frog banned, in a sense that the deck's plan B with, Barrogoyfs, a little bit of Bowmaster, a little bit of Murktide, it's simply not the same as Psychic Frog. It's serviceable, it will get the job done, but it's not the same. So totally balanced deck, but it plays out of the graveyard just like Oops. Let's try and keep an eye out for how many decks actually play out of the graveyard. And now this is my favorite column, actually. Well, maybe second favorite, let's see. 3 copies of Painter made the top 8s of these tournaments, including a sweet, sweet version with Barrogoyf and Pyrogoyf in it that wiped me out of the top 4 in the challenge where I played Mono Red. Painter is still an expert deck. Painter is not a deck that anybody can just pick up. Oh, this looks fun, I'll play Painter. Requires a lot of practice, and that practice is paying off for these players. It's the same names that I see over and over again, so really love to highlight that one. Then we have the Orzhov Death and Taxes deck that I highlighted, I believe, maybe like 3 or 4 weeks ago as a good solution to a metagame where, we need to combat Delver, we need to combat, getting Blood Mooned, and we can spend a lot of sideboard slots beating the graveyard. Maybe this is a good solution, right? We also play Orcish Bowmasters in this deck, which is awesome against the field. Very, very cool to see, and I believe that deck even played a new tool that we can talk about a little bit later. Next up is Doomsday, another expert deck. It's So when I say an expert deck, I basically mean stuff that requires years of practice, that has a very dedicated community, and basically just showing what hard work and having a network in Magic can do in order to enhance your performance. So these Doomsday players, they've been playing it through, Mono White Initiative, Delver with Iteration. They've been playing this deck forever, basically, through the Reanimator meta even, and they keep doing well with it. So what does that tell us? Does that tell us that in a vacuum, Doomsday is like the strongest deck in Legacy? No, not at all. It shows that we can overcome that with a deck expert multiplier, as I like to call it. And yeah, awesome to see. These Doomsday decks are always a treat to watch. Unfortunately, whenever I get to watch them, it's usually because I'm playing against them, and at that point, I guess my interest is kind of mixed. But I do enjoy some big braining Doomsday. Next up, we have 2 copies of what I call Fast Reanimator. These decks can be, splashing green for the pivot sideboard plan with the Magecraft guys and Chain of Smog, or they can be red with, classic Faithless Looting. But yeah, Fast Reanimator apparently is still thriving as a more than just a niche deck in a format full of oops and full of Dimir Animator, which in theory should make people more worried about the graveyard, but it still keeps putting up results. So yeah, love to see it. This is probably my favorite column, so I'm glad I changed it to my second favorite, the one with the Painter and the Doomsdays. Another deck that crushed me in my run the other day. No, that was a different tournament. My bad. Whatever. I played against a nice Nadu deck with Plagon, Lord of the Beach. So we have, Tamios, Nobles, Delighted Halfling. Just awesome cards here, and then a Plagon to draw a bunch of cards. So my opponent didn't draw a bunch of cards against me, but my opponent ended up taking down the challenge. So obviously some cards were drawn in a route to that victory. So yeah, awesome to see. A nice band to brew. And I'm actually pretty excited to toy around with this card. So look out on the channel later this week. No spoilers. Then we have With a Bloom Apprentice here, which is basically to symbolize the Magecraft plus, so you have the Witch, you have the Apprentice, then you play 4 Chain of Smogs and 4 Spoilers of the Vault, and then just a bunch of discard spells. So you basically go into a shell of, let's say, very similar to like Turbo Depths decks of old, and you just have like a 1-2 punch combo and you hope to win the game. Funnily enough, this player was the same that top 8'd with Fast Reanimator, where that plan was a sideboard plan, and then in this tournament, it was the other way around. So once again, an opponent playing around with abusing the fact that you can Google your opponent, what's their last results, and then, you can kind of get it wrong, and that's what this player is a master of, apparently. So pretty awesome to see. The next deck was a Mardu Tokens deck, featuring a Johnny, you have your Broadside Bombardiers, and that's just, I think the deck was a 4 Cabal Therapy deck as well. And that's just pretty cool to see how a bunch of modern cards basically come together, and all of a sudden you have a functional pile, and you end up making top 8 of a highly competitive tournament. So this deck is not the new hot sauce or whatever, but it's just amazing that it's possible, right? It's a sign of a good format. Then we have a Lance player just like last week, and just like last week, this Lance player took down a challenge. So very awesome to see that nobody else besides this player is believing in Lance at the moment and getting the job done your way. Gotta love it. 1 copy of Sneak Attack. That's kind of, to be expected. It's not the best deck in the Legacy, but it's always competitive and can get kind of over the hump. So now I try to be witty here. Gone Missing. No copies of this card were in these top 8s, but I want to talk a little bit about the 0 copies of Eldrazi. 0. No Eldrazi decks in these top 8s. And we still hear complaints about how Eldrazi works, how Eldrazi is frustrating to play against, this and that. Every week I get a message from players who experienced either they had a bad time against Eldrazi, or Eldrazi pilots showing me like frustrating chats from their opponents in game. I think it has to stop. Eldrazi is totally reasonable. Imagine the deck didn't have Cavern of Souls or Micah Spawn. The deck would just not be playable. So I don't know what the alternative is here. This deck is cool, and it's cool to have in the metagame as something you have to think about. I will say Nadu did top 8, but it was in a it was in a Plagon brew rather. So Nadu is still not performing up to what you would expect, post Psychic Frog ban. Oh, Nadu is a foregone conclusion. This card will dominate the format, this and that. And every time I say this, people will tell me in the comments that, oh yeah, it sees a lot of play, you know, locally, it sees a lot of play here and there. Totally fine. I'm waiting for it to get to Magic Online and dominate there as prognosed. And until that, I'm not going to treat it as like a big serious thing, but for sure, like a, I don't know, a role player in the metagame, that almost feels wrong to say. So that was the breakdown of every deck that made top 8. If I'm going to say something general, it's that these blue fair decks is making up a huge chunk of the metagame, as is the graveyard. So that's kind of the two things you need to think about. You need to think about, which is basically 10 graveyard decks, that's 25%. It's 12 tempo decks, that's more than that. I'm bad at math. That's kind of the big things you have to think about. Blood Moon is looming, Ritual combo is looming, getting painted is looming, and then all of these, you know, assorted decks. So the message is basically make sure you're not only gunning for the top of the metagame, and make sure you can still beat, let's say, random decks, assorted decks. So now let's get into the sideboard and get into a deep analysis. Okay, I tried to turn up the humor on this one. Let me know if it works. So Orcish Bowmasters and Molten Collapse, these two cards I want to talk a little bit about because they are featured in Grixis Delver, both of them. And Bowmasters is kind of featured all over the place. So let's talk a little bit about Bowmasters. Why is that good? It's good because so much of the format is about casting cantrips. It's good because so much of the format is about playing out a Delver. And at that point, Orcish Bowmasters, the worst thing you can do is just, you know, to raise the alarm, basically. And then even against those decks, they might have like the one ring you can blow out your opponent, or what do I know. So Orcish Bowmasters, very, very solid card right now. And if I'm going to play a fair deck, I'm going to play Orcish Bowmasters. Molten Collapse is a reason to play Grixis, so you get a better 1-drop out of Channeler, but you also get better catch-all removal in Molten Collapse. This card will kill Murktide Regent and Chalice of the Void, both of which are huge threats to Grixis. I will mention that that deck is worse against Blood Moon, so you kind of have to analyze the metagame and see if you can, quote-unquote, get away with it. But in a vacuum, it is better card quality. It's just, you know, less of a robust mana base. Up next, we have Ketramos, the new Dawn, which is exactly that. It's a new card. 4/4, Menace, Lifelink, Indestructible for 3 mana. Can't attack or block unless there are 7 or more cards in exile. That counts your exile, your opponent's exile. And then it has this text. Whenever 1 or more cards are put into exile from graveyards and or the battlefield during your turn, you draw a card. And lose 1 life. So if you exile your own stuff, you draw a card. If you exile your opponent's stuff, you draw a card. So that means if you ply your opponent's creature, you draw a card. If you exile a card from your own graveyard with Emperor, you draw a card. There's a bunch of stuff here. Even Blinks with Philia, you draw a card. So I'm pretty excited about this one. The jury is still out, but it's kind of cool that it's seen playing these Orzhov Taxes decks straight out the gates. Always cool when new cards have impact, right? Then to round out the show, I want to talk about some returning customers here. We have Consigned Memory, which stock is tanking. At some point, I was closer to putting the 4th copy in my sideboard than cutting my 3rd copy. But that's not the case anymore. I'm closer to cutting my 3rd copy, and I don't think it would be terrible. I will say, with Painter at the winner's table, maybe it's not time yet. It's good against red. It's good against Painter. I mean, who knows, right? But I just wanted to mention that with Eldrazi on a decline, that slot is definitely up for grabs. So Hydroblast is a weird one because it's good against Painter, it's good against Moon, it's obviously good against Sneak Attack, which, you know, is some kind of role player, and it's good against red Delver versions. So you kind of have to keep an eye out for how much of the tempo, you know, chunk of decks are moving to blue-black and how many are, you know, the Teamers of the world, the Grixis of the world. And that, the answer to that question is going to determine whether or not you should register 2 Hydroblast, 1 Hydroblast, or 0 Hydroblast. So right now I'm leaning 1 Hydroblast with the uptick in blue-black. But let's say we remove 3 copies of blue-black, they became Teamer, then all of a sudden I'm back on 2 Hydroblast because all the Delver decks plus Painter plus Moon, that's a ton of equity to get out of your 1-drop sideboard card. So all of these things are moving parts and they change week to week. And that's why I'm making this show, to basically say that studying Magic can be fun. You're not, guaranteeing any wins by cutting a Consign and a Hydroblast, adding, 2 different cards to your sideboard, but you are putting yourself in a better position to do well. And at the end of the day, that's all we can do, because in a game full of a ton of variance, we need all the advantages we can get here. And yeah, I think alongside that point of the small percentages mattering, I think I'll just say, if people can win a challenge with old school lands, if they can win a challenge with Plagon, they can top 8 with Witherbloom Apprentice, and don't get me started on Goblin Bombardment. What's your excuse for not top 8ing the next Legacy challenge? I hope you guys had a good time today. I sure did. I think we got around and talked about a lot of different stuff. And yeah, I can't wait to see you back on the channel soon. Tomorrow it's Try Hard Tuesday. Don't miss it. See you guys.